My grandmother has worried about the state of my soul for my entire life. She's a conservative Lutheran, raised in and surrounded by a family of conservative Lutherans. Both of my parents grew up in that context, and when they lived in Chicago before I was born, they started attending a Lutheran church right down the street. It was close by, it had a great choir. So they sent a letter home telling them that they found this great Lutheran church. Very soon after, a letter from my Lutheran minister uncle arrived, telling my mother that she was in grave spiritual danger. That church was a Wisconsin Synod church. Her family was Missouri Synod. In their minds, the only right and true synod. Just that one difference was enough to send you straight to hell. So my parents became Unitarians. If they were going to sin, they were going to sin boldly. So as an aside, you'll notice that I speak of my grandmother in the present tense. She is 107 years old, with an amazing spirit. She is likely, unfortunately, in her last days, so I may be leaving town this next weekend to attend a service. But if you're interested, I'll show you my favorite picture of her from last summer. She was asked to be the marshal of the 4th of July parade in her hometown. She got to ride around in a Cadillac convertible, sporting a pink hat and long white gloves, and she was having the time of her life. But back to her concern for our souls. The fact that my parents raised my sister and I in such an apostate church was a source of great distress to her. She begged my mother to let us come to summer Bible school at her hometown. And so my mother finally gave in when I was about 6 years old. She dropped us off for the week. And at the end of the week, she came back and picked us up and asked me, "So what did you learn?" And I told her some of the Bible stories that I had heard and some of the dogma that I had been given. And then I looked at my mother and I said, "That stuff's just not true, is it?" And my mother says that she knew at that moment I was destined to become a Unitarian Universalist minister. I promise I'm not going to tell you my whole life story this morning. As Roald Dahl once said, an autobiography is a book a person writes about his own life, and it is usually full of all sorts of boring details. Nor do I wish to overshare, or as Diana Ross said, I want an autobiography without revealing any personal information. But I do want to do everything I can to help build a trusting relationship between us. And one way to do that is to help you get to know me and understand how I came to be in the ministry and why I've chosen to be with you at this critical time in the life of this congregation. I was one of those weird kids that loved going to church. The minister when I was growing up was a great preacher, but I think even more importantly, going to a UU church helped me feel that there was a community in which I could be surrounded by people who shared my values. We lived in a small town on the Gulf Coast of Texas where it hadn't been too long before we moved there that there were still segregated schools, and most of the people of color in town lived on dirt roads with very little town service. It was the kind of place where the first thing anyone wanted to know about you was, which church did you go to? And I assure you, when I responded that I was a UU, it was not greeted with understanding or pleasure. Most of them wanted to know when I had joined the Moonies. When I went to college at the University of Texas, I became extremely politically active and worked in the legislature and in campaigns and offices of progressive politicians. It was the golden age of Texas progressive politics when Ann Richards and Jim Hightower, who I worked for, reigned supreme. It was a great experience, and I learned much about building coalitions among diverse people and finding ways to convey progressive values. But over time, I found myself more and more cynical with the process and the outcomes, which fell far short of the mark of making a better world that I had dreamed of. I had a lot of respect for Jim Hightower, but he was wont to say things that did not endear him to the legislators who controlled his budget. He would say things like, "There's nothing in the middle of the road but yellow stripes and dead armadillos." Or of a legislator he truly disliked, he said, "You know he's level-headed because tobacco juice runs out of both sides of his mouth." And lucky me, I was a legislative liaison. So I started going back to church to relieve my spirit. And as I would sit there, I would watch the minister and think, I could do that. I could spend all of my time reading and writing and reflecting and doing social justice with heart. And somehow I missed the part about endless committee meetings and capital campaigns and arguments about flowers on the altar. But it offered me a way to think about bringing about change by speaking to people's minds and hearts, not just changing laws and structures. Trying to make meaning of the world around us felt more appealing than pushing ever larger boulders up hills. I went to Harvard Divinity School, where I learned a great deal about religious history and practices, the power of theology, and the role that religion plays in people's psyches and cultures. I also learned that Unitarian Universalism didn't have a corner on the truth or the good. I learned respect for other religious traditions that were far deeper than I had ever realized. I also had a chance to work at the UUA, our denominational headquarters, in a variety of capacities, and found out about the challenges of providing resources to diverse and demanding groups. My first two ministries were in urban settings, in Detroit and Chicago. They were two of the most racially diverse congregations in our movement, and I relished being in that kind of environment. I learned a lot, and I grew a lot, and hopefully I offered a lot. The churches I served grew in numbers and in resources and in community engagement, but there were some great frustrations as well. The culture wars, where each disadvantaged group wanted to claim the greatest disadvantage was theirs. The endless demands on my time and attention. The people who expected the most and gave the least. After 8 years, I found myself burned out and disillusioned, wondering whether ministry was really for me. I left the parish thinking that a nice 9-to-5 job that you could leave at the end of the day sounded really good. And of course it wasn't. I missed the community. I missed the kids. I missed the aspirations and the meaning-making. So I took an interim ministry in Stratford, Connecticut, in circumstances very similar to where you find yourselves. A minister who had left abruptly, leaving wounds and trauma in her wake. I loved the people there, who learned that everyone didn't have to agree about what happened, and who took charge of their church and determined to rebuild. My call to ministry had reignited, and I remembered the good that churches can do. I began a Doctor of Ministry program at Hartford Seminary, and I focused on organizational development and strategic planning, and I fell in love with systems thinking and leadership and organizational change. I then took a call to the Unitarian Meeting House in Hartford, which was a larger mid-sized church with a thriving RE program and wonderful leadership. We went through the trauma of 9/11 together, and I deeply felt the healing that can come from being in loving community. I continued my doctoral studies and started inflicting all my newly learned group processes on the church. After I finished my program, I realized how much I loved doing that organizational work. And as wonderful as that congregation was, I was feeling called to take my learning to help other congregations and leaders. I then became the district executive in the Mass Bay District, serving the 65 congregations in the Boston area. Yes, there are really 65 in about 50 square miles. I used to say you couldn't throw a rock in Boston without hitting a UU church. Not that you want to throw a rock at a church, but you get my meaning. I love just about everything about that work, creating learning opportunities for ministers and lay leaders, coaching leaders in crisis, even counseling congregations in conflict, while not pleasant, ended up being satisfying in the long run as I learned that it is possible to come out the other side of what feels like an impossible, difficult circumstance and regain a sense of loving community. I promise it happens. I was also asked by the UUA to create large-scale learning opportunities, and I was the leader of what was called UU University at General Assembly for 3 years. Then I was promoted to be Director of Congregational Life, overseeing all of our district and field staff. At the time, the UUA was beginning a process known as regionalization. It would take far too long to explain what it was about, but suffice it to say, people were very emotionally attached to the structures that were. They cared deeply about governance structures. Imagine that. And they were loath to change, even when the changes made sense. Lucky me, I was charged with helping facilitate that change. I'm not quite sure what sin I had committed to earn that right, but I learned so much in the process. I learned that change is always an emotional process, that bringing change requires listening deeply to what is important to people. And most importantly, I learned that people needed to take charge of the changes themselves, not have it imposed upon them. And miracle of miracles, the old system of 39 districts began to deconstruct to create 5 regions, now in greater alignment with the UUA. It's not perfect, but roles and responsibilities and accountabilities are clearer. I was then made Vice President of Program and Strategy, bringing together 8 different program areas of the UUA and overseeing initiatives such as Congregations and Beyond, which was exploring how we could serve people who may not be able or inclined to come to church. I helped create a new marketing initiative, and I learned just how explosive the introduction of a new logo can be. The time was getting close to the end of Peter Morales' term as president, and the window for creating new initiatives was closing, and I am somebody who always has to have a new initiative. I flirted with the idea of running for UUA president, but I realized I wasn't interested in being a figurehead, and I was very fond of controversial opinions that would not be good for me or for them. After nearly 25 years in the UU system, I was craving an opportunity to do something different. And so I took a self-funded sabbatical and spent a year learning everything I could about our nonprofit system. I could tell you my opinions about that another time. But eventually I became the executive director of the Center for Courage and Renewal in Seattle, the organization founded upon the group processes developed by Parker Palmer, and I know you've been practicing those very processes here. It was wonderful meeting so many people dedicated to helping professionals of all kinds come back to a deeper understanding of what they were trying to do with their lives. And then I got a very scary diagnosis. Around Christmas time, I learned that I had a severe back deformity that would require major surgery to fix. And if I didn't do that surgery, I was risking paralysis. Needless to say, I chose surgery. It was going to require 2 full days of surgery, reconstructing my back, and I knew it would take months of healing to recover. And so I decided not to hold up the forward progress of the center and left that position to concentrate on my health. And I am very glad to say that I came through the surgeries incredibly well. and I'm not in perfect condition yet, but I have every expectation of being back at full capacity. I can't tell you how blessed and lucky I feel. So then, as often happens after a health crisis, my priorities changed. I wanted to get back to a community I knew and loved. I missed preaching and teaching and multi-generational communities. I missed doing memorial services, of all things. This prodigal daughter wanted to return home. Interim ministry seemed the best fit for my organizational skills, and I was eager to work in a large church context. And then we found each other. I'm thrilled to be working in a congregation that has brought so much spiritual sustenance to so many, and that takes its values out into the world in profound ways. I know you've been through extremely difficult times, but I also know that is not your whole story. What often happens during a traumatic time is that your sense of your story grows narrow and consumed by the trauma. But there is far more to you than that. Now that I've told you so much about my own story, I am eager to hear yours. The stories of challenge and of joy, of heartbreak and of healing. There is not just one story, as you are not just one people. Some of those stories will contradict one another, and that is as it should be. It is in the telling and in the bringing to light that stories both gain and lose their power. They help us gain perspective, and they no longer hold us hostage. As Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie says, stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. We have chosen the hard path of the ever-unfolding story. Never sure of its ending, never clear about where it truly comes from, but resting lightly in the assurance that it is how we tell the story and how we act on its meaning that is most important. Ultimately, of course, we don't know how the story ends. The universe unfolds far more mysteriously than our prophecies or forecasts can predict. The question is, can we have faith anyway? Not in the plot, but in the telling, in the character of the human nature which tries and fails and tries and fails again, but still retains a sense of the good and the true and the right. It is a pleasure and an honor to begin this process with you. May our stories together begin. Amen.